Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of instructional videos here on YouTube. Today, I'd like to continue with our discussion of that all-important issue in chess called time management. You know, all serious chess games are played with a clock. These days, slow games are always played with time delays and increments. And how you handle your clock is really important. So we had a earlier video, which if you haven't seen, I recommend, called Introduction to Time Management. And we're going to somewhat assume that you've listened to that video, watched that video. And we're going to talk a little bit today about how you're going to know when to stop thinking and tell your hand to go make that move. And I call that event a move trigger. So what's happening is something in your thought process is triggering your brain to say, I'm done, let's make that move. And what I've discovered in the past, and I've written about this extensively now, is there's only two legitimate move triggers, and we'll talk about both of them in the video today. How did I arrive at that? Well, it's a very interesting story, and I won't go into the whole story. I talked about it in my Novice Nook, the two move triggers, and I wrote about it in my book, The Improving Chess, my book, A Guide to Chess Improvement, that I heard this saying, never make a bad move fast. And I thought about it for 3 days, not just what it meant superficially, but what it really meant in terms of chess theory. And of course, never make a bad move fast makes a lot of sense, because if you are, and again, we're assuming fast means relatively fast. If you're playing a speed game, every move is going to be fast, but we're talking about too fast for the time that you have. So never make a bad move fast makes sense, because if you know what you're doing and you're 100% sure that your move is a good one, then you can play more quickly. But if you don't know what you're doing, then you're going to take time to try to figure it out. And if you do it wrong, then you're going to make a mistake. So all your mistakes are going to take time. And in fact, I looked at my history and I said, you know, that's really true. All the kind of worst mistakes I've ever made after I got to be a good player were moves where I took a fair amount of time. There's almost no bad mistakes that I made where I played relatively, too fast for the time situation. Okay. Now, a lot of people out there have their own move triggers. They look at the board and they say, ooh, that move looks interesting, or that move looks good, and they just make the move, and that's their trigger. Well, that's okay for a fun game or a casual game, but if you're really trying to be a good chess player, you don't just want to settle for, that looks interesting. If you're playing speed games, sure, this kind of trigger is perfectly acceptable. But we're really talking about triggers in serious slow games. Let's talk about the first trigger right here. Let's make some moves. E4, E5, D4, D6, F4, F6. I'm just trying to set up a position. D takes E5, D takes E5, Queen takes D8, check. Okay, it's Black's move. Black has two legal moves. He has King takes D8, he has King F7. All right, here, obviously, Black should not take a lot of time. He should be able to figure out that King takes D8 is better than King F7, and since those are the only two moves, he should play King D8 immediately. I call this trigger 1. Trigger 1 is where you basically have proven that there can't possibly be a better move. Here, since there's only two legal moves, and one of them stays down a queen, and the other one recaptures the queen, this is trigger 1. So for instance, suppose this game was being played at 40 moves in 2 hours, and you have an average of 3 minutes per move. If you take more than a few seconds for this move and don't play King D8, you're just wasting your time. If you say, the way I handle my time is I take exactly 3 minutes on every move, that's a terrible way of figuring out your time. And even though that's your average amount of time, here you want to play immediately and allow more time for critical moves where you have decisions later. So again, I call this trigger 1, which is basically proving that there can't be a better move. Now, when I say a better move, a lot of people take that to mean, the move where the computer gives the best evaluation. And here, that's clearly going to be true. But let's take a weird example. Let's say you're losing and you have a move that may be not the computer's best move, but at least it sets some sort of trap or some complication where your opponent might go wrong and let you get back in the game. If you play normally and you play the computer's best move, you're just going to lose. You should just resign. Well, in that sense, the best move isn't the move with the highest evaluation. It's the move that gives you the best chance to get the best score that you can get. And since you're losing and you're going to get 0 if your opponent plays right anyway, playing a move that gives you a chance to get a draw or get back in the game and even possibly win might be the best move, even though it doesn't give the highest computer evaluation. So here, when I'm talking about trigger 1 and I'm saying you can prove that there can't possibly be a better move, we have to take into account that there are some situations where the highest evaluation isn't necessarily the move that best gives you your chance of achieving what you want to achieve. There's another way of looking at that, and I wrote in Novice Nook about this. I called it the room full of grandmasters. And I said, suppose you're a class player, you're rated 13, 14, 1500, and you're not sure what to do, and you're pretty sure that your move is the best move. I said, if you're willing to get up in front of a room full of grandmasters and put your position on the board and say, I am willing to argue with anybody in this room that you can't find a better move than this move here. If you're willing to do that, and you've taken the time and you've done the work that you need to do, you're not just guessing, and you're willing to argue with a room full of grandmasters that they can't find a move that's clearly better than your move, then that's trigger 1. So here, this would be true. In this position after queen takes d8 check, you should be willing to get up and put this position on the board and say to a room full of grandmasters, I'm going to play king takes d8. I will argue with anyone here that it wants to tell me that king f7 is a better move. So I call that the room full of grandmasters argument. All right, let's take a look at the more normal trigger. The more normal trigger is not that you've clearly found the best move, because in most positions, it's very hard for humans to claim, I have absolutely found the best move. There is no doubt about it. We just saw a position where that's clearly true. Let's try a different type of position. Let's say d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, e3, e6, c4, c6, knight c3, bishop e7. All right, let's say you're in this position for white, and you're pretty sure you want to bring out your bishop on f1, and then you want a castle. But you're not sure whether bishop e2 or bishop d3 is the right move. I don't think you'd be willing to get in front of a room full of grandmasters and say, I think bishop d3 is the right move, and I'm willing to argue with a room full of grandmasters that bishop e2 isn't better. Well, you may be right, and you may be willing to argue, but it's going to be hard to really prove that bishop e1, bishop d3 is better than bishop e2. I mean, I think it is, but let's say you don't know that for sure, and you haven't played over enough games to realize that bishop d3 is the normal move. If you give this to the computer, it's going to say that there's a very small difference. Let's do that right now. It may tell me that b3 or something is a better move, but let's give the computer, there we go. Okay, bishop e2 and bishop d3 do show up in the top 3. Now it's looking at queen c2. Maybe we have to go to the top 4 or 5. All right, there we are. And right now, bishop d3 is like 0.06 of a pawn higher than bishop e2. Now it's a little bit more than that, but we're talking about very, very, very small numbers. It's not a critical move, and humans are not going to be able to discern whether something is 0.07 of a pawn better than another move. So here, you're not going to be able to reach trigger 1 at all. But you can't sit there forever trying to prove that bishop d3 is better than bishop e2. It's just not going to be possible. So therefore, you need the more common trigger, which I call trigger 2, which is, what's a reasonable time for this move? And this we talked about in the last video. This is a much more difficult question, trigger 2. So what do you need to figure this out? Well, generally you need at least 3 things. The 3 things you need is the time control. For instance, if you're playing a 5-minute game, you're going to have a lot less time than if you're playing 40 moves in 2 hours. You need your time remaining on your clock. If you are playing 40 moves in 2 hours and you've got 1 hour 58 left, then you have a little bit more time than if you're playing 40 and 2 and you have 23 seconds left. The third thing, of course, is that you need to do to figure out trigger 2 is the position. Obviously, without the position, you can't figure it out. And fourth, if you're playing a time control that's not sudden death, let's say you are playing 40 and 2, you also need to know your move number. For instance, if you have 5 minutes left and you're on move 6 here, because you've taken an hour and 55 minutes to play your first 5 moves, then your time to figure out bishop e2 versus bishop d3 is very, very small. But if you have an hour and 58 minutes left and you're on move 6, then you have a lot of time relatively to figure it out. Now, what's reasonable? Well, since this is a non-critical move, and since you average 3 minutes a move, let's say you do have an hour and 58 left on your clock, and it's move 6, and you're differentiating bishop e2 versus bishop d3, you have an average of 3 minutes per move. If you take 3 minutes on a move like this, then when you actually have critical moves that are complicated later in the game, you're going to not have enough time to take 10 or 15 minutes if you need it to figure things out. Whereas we talked about earlier, I mentioned from Grandmaster Rowson's book, if you have a judgmental move like this, you're judging whether bishop e2 is better than bishop d3. If you take longer, your judgment won't necessarily get better. But if you take longer, your analysis will get better. So here, it's a judgmental move, and there's not a lot to it. They're both clearly safe. So trigger 2, the reasonable amount of time for this move, if you have an hour and 58 minutes left and you're on move 6, is way less than 3 minutes. If you can't differentiate between bishop e2 and bishop d3 in about 40 seconds or a minute at most, you should just flip a coin and play one. That's about the way you should decide. So here, let's say at the most, trigger 2 would be 1 minute. So what would happen is if a good player is playing and he understands what's going on here, he might sit there and after 40 seconds, he'll start to get a little antsy and start to think, I really can't take a lot of time on this move. I'm going to need my time later in the game. And when it gets to about 1 minute or a little more, his trigger 2 is going to start ringing. Bing, 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 bing. Your trigger is going off. Pick up your hand, make your move, hit your clock. They're both completely safe. Pick one. If you pick the wrong one, later on you can use an engine, an opening book. You can talk to your opponent, whatever you need to figure out what you should do next time. But for this time, you just can't sit there for 20 minutes and dither back and forth between bishop e2 and bishop to d3. Okay, so let's review what I just said. The 4 things you need to figure out what's a reasonable time for your move is the position, how much time is remaining on your clock, the time control, and if you're not in sudden death, the move number. Okay, now do good players sit here and figure this out? Do they take time and say, all right, it's my move, I'm on move 6, I have an hour and 58 minutes left, the time control is 40 and 2, and I've got this position. How much time is reasonable for this move? The answer is, of course not. They don't do that at all. It's all very subconscious. They're very well aware of what the time situation is. They're aware it's early in the game. They're aware they have a lot of time on their clock. They really don't care whether it's an hour and 58 or an hour and 57. They're not going to look at their clock. They're just going to look at the board and say, both those moves are completely safe. There's probably not a lot of difference. I kind of like this move for this reason. Is there any reason to think about this much longer? No, there's not. Let's save my time for later. Boom. That's what they do. They don't try to calculate on each move what's a reasonable amount of time for the move. That's just not how it works. Okay. All right. Let's look at a different kind of situation. Let's pull up number 203 here. Examine %203. Now, I couldn't remember the exact position, but I had a student a few years ago who was playing in a tournament game, and he was white, and he knew he was better because his king was closer to the pawns, and black had just played a move like h5. Now, this is probably not the position from their game, but it's close enough that for the purposes of this discussion, it's fine. And he knew he was winning, and he had been playing pretty slow. He was playing 40 moves in 2 hours, followed by sudden death in an hour with maybe a 5-second time delay. And he got to this position and he had about, 48 minutes on his clock. And it was his move and he had to figure this out. Well, so anyway, he had about 50 minutes left on his clock here. And clearly the game is being decided right here. He needs to take his time and figure out what he needs to do to try to win the game. And he's already taken over 2 hours, so my student had a lot of time here to figure this out, and he's proven that he's been able to play slow by having taken the 2 hours. However, he was getting a little frustrated here. He didn't really want to figure this out. He wanted to just kind of hand wave it. We've talked about hand waving before. Instead of figuring out which move would lead toward a winning position, he said, well, rather than figuring it out, I just used the principle that you taught me, which is when you're winning, trade down. Well, actually, that's not the principle. The principle is when you're ahead in material, trade pieces, but not necessarily pawns. In fact, when there's not very many pawns on the board, it becomes exactly the opposite. You want to not trade pawns because you need pawns on the board to win. Here it turns out that keeping the pawns on the board with a move like g5, let's let Stockfish help us here. We'll open up the analysis so you can see it on the bottom. g5 draws after king d2, and what's going to happen is the white king's going to get blocked out from going after the pawn on g6. If white plays king f3, then king d3. Obviously, if king f4, king d4. If h4, king d5, and white's not winning here. So keeping the pawns on the board with g5 is not right. Taking the pawn, g takes h5, only gives you a rook pawn. And after he takes back, if white plays h4, let's say white plays king g3, king e2, king h4, king f3, king h5, king f4. Now white's got a problem. If he plays king g6, then king g3 will win the pawn. But if he plays h4, then king f5 will keep his king boxed in the corner. If he moves his king back to h5, black's king will get into the corner. And if he pushes the pawn, then black will continue to go toward the corner, and white will either have to let him in the corner or box himself in the corner. We've seen this before in my video, king and pawn against king with the rook pawn case. So it's not quite that easy. So as you can see, the computer says the right idea here is to move your king toward the pawn. Either king g3, king f3, or king e3 will eventually win. So here, if you're using the move triggers, then the only way you should really trigger is if you take your time, roll up your sleeves, analyze the lines, and figure out which moves might win and which moves draw. You can't, you're not going to run out of time with 50 minutes on your clock. What's a reasonable amount of time for this position? Well, that's a good question. The answer is, if you can figure out it's a win and you can checkmate with a king and a queen against a king, you could almost take, if you have 50 minutes left, you could almost take 48, 49, almost 50 minutes for this move. And if your calculations are correct, and you could then play the rest of the moves relatively quickly, especially if you have a time delay or increment, you could take almost all your time on this move to figure out what you should do. And in fact, you have to do that. So here, because the game is almost over, and this is a critical move that will decide the game, if you do trade pawns like he did, you're throwing away the win immediately. So it's super critical that you find one of the winning moves here. Let's put the board back to full size. Okay. So here, move, you can move after, let's say, 10 minutes, which is something that I would do here with trigger 1, because you would prove that, yes, I can win the game if I play this move, and I've checked it a million times, and I've checked all the analysis, and I'm right, it took me 10 minutes. Or if you were worried about trigger 2, if you say, oh, I only have 50 minutes left, you could wait 40 minutes, and if after 40 minutes you hadn't figured it out, and you'd probably get really tired and confused by that point. But if you hadn't, trigger 2 probably wouldn't have gone off till then. You don't have to worry about trigger 2 in this kind of position going off in a minute or two. It's not going to happen. Trigger 2 in these critical endgame positions, when you have a lot of time, expands to be almost the entire amount of time left on your clock. So here, as I said, I would probably move on trigger 1, but it would take me several minutes. Trigger 2 probably wouldn't happen for a long time. And what my student did, which is sort of wave his hands and say, oh, I'm winning, so I should trade, that's a really, really bad way to play. And he made that move, I think it took him about 30 seconds. And in 30 seconds, of course, he couldn't have figured anything like we just looked at out. It's just not possible. So he's just kind of waving his hand at it. He didn't want to do the work. Afterwards, I said, how long would it have taken you to figure this out if you had figured it out instead? And he said 10 minutes. I said, well, you got like 48, 50 minutes. You need to take it because, if you take 10 minutes and you figure it all out and you made a mistake, okay, join the rest of us. We all, none of us are computers. We make mistakes sometimes. But if you don't even try and you just say, well, I got 50 minutes, but I'm winning, I'll just take the pawn since I'm supposed to trade, that's not good. And of course, anybody watching the video should learn what he learned, which is, no, the principle doesn't say when you're winning, trade. It says if you're ahead in material, then generally, not always, but generally, you want to trade pieces, but not necessarily pawns. In this case, definitely not pawns unless you have to. Now, if you play the move King G3, it does allow black to trade pawns, but in that case, black can't draw. For instance, let's say King F3, pawn takes pawn. What would white take back with here? Well, I'm pretty sure he would take back with the pawn. If he takes with the king, he's got a rook pawn again. If he takes with the pawn, he's threatening king here and up. If black plays here, white plays here, he's going to come up and take the pawn. And as we saw in king and one pawn against king, this is a trivial win. So a move like king F3 is a nice, safe move. If black plays on king F3, if black plays H4, you're probably just winning with a move either like king to F4 or G5. Let's ask Stockfish. King F4 and G5 both winning, Mr. Stockfish? No. G5 is a draw. See, I'm just guessing and I guessed wrong. The only move to draw here for black, wow, this is tough stuff. King E1, King G4, King F2. If King H4, King F3, stalemate. Stalemate trick. So, it turns out G5 doesn't win. And would I figure that out in a slow game? You betcha. Unless I'm in time trouble and, I have to move right away and I'm going to miss this. In time trouble, trigger 2 becomes very, very, very short. And you rarely get to trigger 1 when you're in time trouble. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit about the some of the issues involved here. What should you do before you get to trigger 2 if you can? Well, first of all, you should make sure that your move is safe. Okay, this is avoiding hope chess. Before you hit trigger 2, or when you do hit around the time you hit trigger 2, you got to say to yourself, if I make this move, does my opponent have any checks, captures, or threats that can beat me? This is one of the things you want to finish before trigger 2, the time limit goes off. You also want to make sure the move is really as good as you thought it was. A lot of times people want to move fairly quickly, and their trigger is, oh, I like this move, and then after they move it, their opponent does something, and they go, oh, whoops, maybe this wasn't as good as I thought it was. So you not only want to make sure your move is safe, you want to make sure it's really as good as you thought it was. The whole idea, of course, eventually, is to try to get in front of the room full of grandmasters and say, you can't find a better move. That's trigger 1, but you're not always going to be able to hit trigger 1. If you can't hit trigger 1 and you're hitting trigger 2 and your time is low, you're not going to be able to prove that your move is better than other moves. That's trigger 1. You already tried that. It failed. Trigger 2 is going off. Your time limit is up. But you still want to make sure your move is safe. Hopefully, you want to make sure your move is as good as you think it was. These things hopefully won't take a lot of time so that trigger 2 isn't going to be ringing off the wall and you'll get into unnecessary time trouble. And as we said, sometimes you have to play a move that's clearly not the best move because you're losing. Or let's say you're drawing and you could play a move that forces a draw. Or you could play another move where maybe it's a little bit harder to draw, but it's really easy for your opponent to go wrong. I actually had a position like that in one of my games in my book, The Improving Annotator, where it took me almost 40 minutes to make the move because I was pretty sure I had found the best move, but I was pretty sure the best move only led to a draw. And I was pretty sure the second best move gave my opponent a lot of problems, but if he found all the right moves, then maybe I wasn't even better, much less, drawing. And it took me about 40 minutes to finally get up the nerve to say, I shouldn't play the best move here. I should play the move that I think gives my opponent the most problems. and I'm really not risking anything because if he plays it perfectly, I think I'm still okay. And that was important because my tendency was, oh, if I know my move's not the best move, then of course I should just use trigger 1 and play it. But rather than that, I used trigger 2 to see not just what was the best move, but what move gave me the best chance of scoring the best in that position. And it turned out, if my opponent plays perfectly on both moves, it's probably getting a draw anyway. So it turned out later on when I had computers that the move I played was actually just as good, if not better, than the move that I thought was the best move. And for all the reasons I just thought I was risking a little bit more at the time, and that's why it took so much time for that move. And I had the time. My trigger 2 was fairly high and the move was fairly critical. Okay, so just as a review, I call this the 2 move triggers. The first trigger is there can't be a better move. You're willing to stand up in front of a room full of grandmasters, in which case you can move relatively quickly once you've reached that point. And of course, if you can't reach that point where you can say there can't be a better move, then you're going to have to move anyway in a reasonable amount of time, and that I call trigger 2. And that takes a lot of skill, but in general, people don't do, they don't figure out, gee, I have 2 minutes and 43 seconds for this move. They just don't do that. They just have a feel, oh, I can take a lot of time or I don't. And I think today we showed some really good basic examples of trigger 1 and trigger 2 and how they're used. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed our video. If you subscribe, by the way, I'm thinking of having a contest when I get to 1,000 subscribers. Right now I have about 920. And I'd like to give away a free lesson to a subscriber. I'm trying to figure out the best way to randomly do that since YouTube doesn't give me a list of all the subscribers. But pass the word. Hopefully we'll get to 1,000 soon. We'll have that contest and we will give away a free lesson. All right, for YouTube, this is my Improving Chess channel. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.